This groundbreaking 1973 vampire film hides shocking secrets behind its experimental facade. From a director who used dirty bathwater to brush his fangs on camera, to legendary critics walking out after 20 minutes yet still reviewing it, to a title secretly referencing marijuana slang. Prepare to discover the bizarre true story of cinema's most misunderstood masterpiece. Fact 1. The title is drug slang. The names Ganja and Hess aren't just character names, they're actually slang terms for drugs. Ganja is a widely recognized term for marijuana that originated from Sanskrit and became popular in Jamaica and beyond, while Hess refers to hashish, a concentrated form of cannabis. Director Bill Gunn deliberately chose these names to reinforce the film's central theme about addiction, using the drug references as a clever metaphor for the blood dependency that afflicts the main characters. This wasn't just a random choice or a coincidence. It was a calculated artistic decision that added another layer of meaning to the story. The film treats vampirism as an addiction rather than a supernatural curse, and having the title literally reference addictive substances was Gunn's way of making sure audiences understood the parallel he was drawing. It's worth noting that in 1973, when the film was released, these drug references would have been immediately recognized by contemporary audiences, especially those familiar with counterculture and jazz communities where such terms were common. The title works on multiple levels. It identifies the two main characters while simultaneously announcing the film's thematic concerns about dependency, craving, and the struggle to break free from destructive habits. Gunn was known for his intellectual approach to filmmaking, and this kind of wordplay was typical of his style, where even something as simple as a title carried deeper symbolic weight. Fact 2. Duane Jones's only other lead role. Duane Jones, who plays Dr. Hess Green in Ganja and Hess, had one of the most unusual careers in cinema history. This film represents one of only 2 lead roles he ever played in his entire acting career, with the other being his groundbreaking performance as Ben in Night of the Living Dead from 1968. While Jones appeared in bit parts and supporting roles in other films like Beat Street and Losing Ground, he never pursued acting as his primary profession. Instead, Jones dedicated most of his life to academia and theater, working as a literature professor at institutions including Antioch College and Long Island University, where he headed the literature department from 1972 to 1976. He also served as the executive director of the Black Theater Alliance and was the artistic director at the Richard Allen Center for Culture and Art in Manhattan, where he promoted African American theater and directed numerous stage productions. Jones was also a Phelps-Stokes Exchange scholar in Niger and helped design programs for the Peace Corps. His casting in Night of the Living Dead was historically significant, as the first time an African American actor portrayed the hero in a horror film where the character's race wasn't specified in the script. Tragically, Jones died in 1988 at the age of 51 from cardiopulmonary arrest, leaving behind a legacy as both a pioneering actor and a dedicated educator who shaped countless students' understanding of literature and performance. Fact 3. The director played a naked suicide. Bill Gunn didn't just write and direct Ganja and Hess, he also cast himself in one of the film's most shocking and visceral scenes. Gunn plays George Mita, Dr. Hess Green's unstable research assistant, who suffers from severe paranoia and suicidal thoughts throughout the early part of the film. The character's mental deterioration culminates in a disturbing sequence where Mita calmly steps out of a bathtub completely naked, holding a gun, and shoots himself directly in the heart. Blood spills across the green bathroom tiles as he falls to the ground, and then Dr. Hess rushes in, not to help his dying assistant, but to desperately lap up the blood from the floor. This scene is both horrifying and pathetic, showing the protagonist's complete surrender to his blood addiction, while also marking the moment when Gunn, as performer, literally exits his own film. The nakedness adds vulnerability to the suicide, making it feel more real and uncomfortable rather than stylized or cinematic. Gunn's willingness to appear fully nude and portray such raw emotional instability demonstrates his commitment to creating authentic, unflinching cinema that challenged audience expectations. The bathroom tile's bright green color creates a stark visual contrast with the red blood, making the scene even more striking. This moment exemplifies Gunn's approach to horror. He wasn't interested in jump scares or supernatural theatrics, but rather in the genuine horror of human desperation and addiction. Fact 4. Nina Simone's brother composed the score, the haunting and experimental music that gives Ganja and Hess its distinctive atmosphere was created by Sam Wayman, who happened to be the younger brother of legendary singer Nina Simone, whose birth name was Eunice Wayman. But Sam Wayman didn't just compose the film's score. He also appears on screen as Reverend Luther Williams, who serves as both Dr. Hess Green's chauffeur and a minister. The music Wayman created was deliberately unusual, mixing soul, gospel, tribal chants, and dissonant experimental sounds to create something completely unlike traditional vampire film scores. He used instruments like the thumb piano along with fuzz and laser-type sounds, heavy reverberations, and repetitive delays to create a hypnotic, trance-like quality that Wayman described as metaphors for how life itself can be full of delays and echoes. The soundtrack also incorporated authentic Bangili tribal music to represent the ancient African civilization of Myrthians depicted in the film. What makes Wayman's performance even more remarkable is that he improvised all of his characters' sermon dialogue based on his own experience as a real preacher earlier in his life. The opening of the film features Wayman's voiceover narration and his song, The Blood of the Thing, which establishes the entire mythological framework of the story through music rather than traditional exposition. Fact 5. A famous novelist appears as an extra hidden among the party guests in Ganja and Hess is one of America's most celebrated and challenging postmodern novelists. William Gaddis, author of complex literary works like The Recognitions and J.R., appears as an extra along with his wife Judith Thompson during a party scene in the film. Gaddis was known for writing dense, experimental novels that featured fragmented narratives, minimal punctuation, and chaotic streams of dialogue. Books that critics initially dismissed as incomprehensible before later recognizing them as masterpieces. His presence in the film adds an interesting metatextual layer because Ganja and Hess itself was similarly misunderstood upon release, with critics calling it a confusing and vague mishmash, just as they had initially responded to Gaddis's early novels. The connection between Gunn and Gaddis makes perfect sense when you consider that both artists were working at the edges of their respective mediums, challenging conventional storytelling and expecting audiences to actively participate in making meaning rather than passively consuming entertainment. Gaddis's novels have been described as a chaos of disconnections and a blizzard of noise, which could equally describe Gunn's elliptical, nonlinear approach to filmmaking. Both men created work that demanded multiple viewings or readings to fully absorb, and both were initially punished by critics who couldn't or wouldn't engage with their experimental visions. The fact that Gaddis agreed to appear in the film suggests mutual respect between two groundbreaking artists. Fact 6. Butchered into 4 different versions. After Ganja and Hess failed at the box office during its initial theatrical run, the film's producers, Kelly and Jordan, were deeply disappointed with both the financial results and Bill Gunn's artistic choices, which they felt strayed too far from the commercial exploitation film they had requested. Rather than accepting their losses, Kelly Jordan Enterprises sold the distribution rights to another company called Heritage Enterprises, which proceeded to mutilate Gunn's vision. Heritage hired post-production specialists from a company called FEMA to drastically re-edit the film, cutting it down from 96 minutes to just 63 minutes, removing over half an hour of carefully crafted material. This butchered version was retitled Blood Couple and marketed as a drive-in exploitation movie, with the new cut emphasizing sex and violence while stripping away the film's philosophical and artistic elements. The re-editors even used footage that Gunn had shot but deliberately excluded from his final cut, rearranging the story into a more linear structure that completely destroyed the dreamlike, meditative quality Gunn had intended. But the story doesn't end there. This compromised version was then re-released again under different titles, including Double Possession in 1975 and Black Vampire, each time being pushed further into the exploitation market. Bill Gunn was so horrified by the Blood Couple re-edit that he walked out of a screening after just 10 minutes and demanded his name be removed from it. Fact 7. The word vampire never appears. Despite Ganja and Hess being fundamentally a vampire film where characters drink blood, become immortal, and pass their condition to others through ritualistic means, director Bill Gunn made the deliberate artistic choice never to use the word vampire or any variation of it throughout the entire movie. There are no references to Dracula, no fangs, no coffins, no aversion to sunlight or crosses, at least not in the traditional vampire movie sense. Instead, Gunn treats the condition as a blood addiction, a disease contracted from an ancient cursed dagger belonging to the Myrthian people, an extinct African civilization that was destroyed by this blood dependency thousands of years ago. Dr. Hess Green walks freely in daylight, sleeps in a regular bed, attends church services, and lives in a mansion staffed by servants who are aware of his condition but don't treat him as a monster. The film uses the vampire mythology as a framework, but completely strips away the Gothic European trappings typically associated with the genre. By avoiding the word vampire and all the cultural baggage that comes with it, Gunn forces viewers to see the story as an exploration of addiction, assimilation, and the ways people become dependent on destructive behaviors or substances. This approach was part of what made the film so confusing to audiences and critics in 1973. Who expected a straightforward horror movie and instead got an art film about dependency and cultural alienation. Fact 8. A critic reviewed it. After 20 minutes, Bill Gunn was furious with how Ganja Hess was received by white American film critics, and he didn't stay silent about it. In May of 1973, Gunn wrote a scathing letter to the New York Times titled "To Be a Black Artist," where he directly called out the critical establishment for their treatment of his film. One of the most shocking revelations in this letter was Gunn's claim that a white critic attended a screening of Ganja Hess, walked out after watching only 20 minutes of the film, and then still proceeded to write and publish a full review of the entire movie. Gunn called this action criminal, noting the profound disrespect shown not just to him as a filmmaker, but to everyone who had worked hard on the production. The letter opens with a bold challenge, stating that there are times when the white critic must sit down and listen, and if they cannot listen and learn, then they must not concern themselves with black creativity. Gunn went on to express his frustration that the film had been selected as the only American entry at Critics Week at the Cannes Film Festival, a significant honor. Yet not one white critic from any major American newspaper even mentioned this achievement. He pointed out the absurdity of imagining producers anxiously waiting for black reviewers' opinions of films like The Sound of Music or A Clockwork Orange, highlighting how black artists were held to different standards. Fact 9. Josephine Baker defended it for 30 minutes. While American critics largely dismissed or misunderstood Ganja Hess, the film found a powerful and unexpected champion in one of the 20th century's most iconic performers. Josephine Baker, the legendary American-born French dancer, singer, and actress who had become famous in Paris during the 1920s and was also known for her civil rights activism, reportedly spent nearly half an hour at the Cannes Film Festival passionately singing the film's praises. According to accounts from people who were present, Baker used this extended defense to directly challenge American critics for their failure to support the film and recognize its artistic achievements. This was particularly meaningful coming from Baker, who had experienced her own struggles with American racism and had found greater acceptance in Europe, eventually becoming a French citizen. Her willingness to dedicate such a substantial amount of time to defending Gunn's work in front of an international audience at Cannes demonstrated her understanding of how groundbreaking and important the film was, even if American critics couldn't or wouldn't see it. Baker's defense also highlighted the pattern of European audiences and critics being more receptive to experimental Black American art than domestic critics were. Her intervention at Cannes is remembered as a significant moment in the film's history, showing how major cultural figures recognized the value of what Gunn had created even as it was being dismissed and butchered back home. Fact 10. Only American film at Cannes Critics Week. In 1973, Ganja Hess achieved something remarkable by being selected as the sole American film to screen during Critics Week at the prestigious Cannes Film Festival. Critics Week is a parallel section of Cannes dedicated to showcasing emerging filmmakers and innovative cinema, and being chosen as the only American representative was a significant honor that should have generated major attention and credibility for the film back home. According to multiple accounts, when Ganja Hess screened at Cannes, it received a standing ovation from the international audience of critics and film professionals who recognized its artistic ambition and experimental approach. The film was even praised as one of the 10 best American films of its decade by Cannes critics, a recognition that would typically launch a film's reputation and commercial prospects. However, when Bill Gunn returned to the United States, he discovered that major American newspapers and critics had essentially ignored this achievement. In his letter to the New York Times, Gunn expressed his frustration that if he were white or European, the film might have been embraced as that little film you must see. But because he was black, he wasn't even afforded the pride that one American feels for another when discovering a fellow countryman's film had been honored internationally. This disconnect between European appreciation and American dismissal highlighted the racial biases in American film criticism at the time. Fact 11. Filmed at a real Brooklyn museum, Ganja, and Hess wasn't filmed on elaborate Hollywood sets. Instead, it used real locations that added authentic cultural weight to the story. The opening sequences where Dr. Hess Green first meets his new assistant George Mita take place at the actual Brooklyn Museum of Art in New York City, one of the country's oldest and largest art museums with extensive collections of African art and cultural artifacts. Filming at this real institution rather than a studio recreation gave the film genuine gravitas and reinforced its themes about African cultural heritage and the ways black artifacts are absorbed into white institutions. The mansion where most of the film takes place, where Dr. Hess lives as a wealthy anthropologist surrounded by his collection of African art, was actually a property called Appleby Farms, located in Croton-on-Hudson, New York, about 25 miles north of Manhattan. Additional scenes were shot in Nyack, where director Bill Gunn himself lived, and in Ossining, which is near Croton-on-Hudson. The decision to shoot at these real locations, rather than on controlled sound stages, was partly a practical choice driven by the film's relatively modest budget of $350,000. But it also served Gunn's artistic vision of creating a film that felt grounded in real spaces rather than theatrical artifice. The Brooklyn Museum's presence at the beginning of the film immediately signals that this will be a movie concerned with cultural history and the relationship between African heritage and American institutions. Fact 12. Gunn's previous film got an X rating. Before making Ganja and Hess, Bill Gunn had directed another feature film called Stop in 1970, which was produced by Warner Brothers with a budget of $1 million. The film was shot in Puerto Rico and centered on a bisexual, interracial love quadrangle involving both male and female homosexual relationships, exploring themes of emotional toxicity and complex desire at a time when such subject matter was considered extremely controversial. When Warner Brothers executives saw the finished film, they gave it a preliminary X rating due to its sexual content, particularly the same-sex and interracial scenes, and then made the decision to permanently shelve the movie rather than release it. This meant that despite the substantial budget and Gunn's creative work, the film never received a theatrical release and remained essentially buried for decades. A video copy was finally screened in 2010 as part of a Bill Gunn retrospective at the Brooklyn Academy of Music, where critics praised its daring vision, with one reviewer describing it as a languid, druggy-decadent psychodrama that emerged at a time when black filmmakers were expected to work in familiar genre frameworks and gritty realism rather than experimental psychological territory. The experience of having his first film suppressed undoubtedly influenced how Gunn approached Ganja and Hess, where he again refused to conform to commercial expectations despite knowing the potential consequences for his career. Fact 13. Experimental rap sampled the soundtrack. Decades after Ganja and Hess first appeared, the film's influence reached a completely new generation through hip-hop. In 2019, the experimental rap group Clipping, which features Tony Award-winning actor and rapper Daveed Diggs, along with producers Jonathan Snipes and William Hudson, released an album called There Existed an Addiction to Blood. The album's title itself was taken directly from lyrics in Sam Wayman's song The Blood of the Thing Part 2 Shadow of the Cross from the Ganja and Hess soundtrack. Clipping built one of their key tracks, Blood of the Fang, around samples of Wayman's score, including both his vocal performance and the Bengali tribal music that appears in the film. The song uses the vampire mythology from Ganja and Hess as a framework for exploring America's history of killing and victimizing militant black leaders, imagining figures like Huey Newton, Malcolm X, Angela Davis, and Afeni Shakur returning from the dead as an army of undead revolutionaries fighting against systems of oppression. This recontextualization demonstrates how Gunn's metaphorical approach to vampirism as cultural consumption and political struggle remained relevant almost 50 years later. Clipping's entire album functions as a horrorcore concept record that uses horror movie themes to examine racism in America, much like Gunn used the vampire genre to explore addiction, assimilation, and black identity in 1973. Fact 14. Spike Lee's shot-for-shot remake. In 2014, acclaimed filmmaker Spike Lee remade Ganja Hess as The Sweet Blood of Jesus, creating a version that was often remarkably faithful to the original. The screenplay was credited to both Lee and Bill Gunn, and critics noted that in many cases, Lee replicated scenes shot for shot and moment for moment from Gunn's original vision. The film starred Stephen Tyrone Williams as Dr. Hess Green and Zaria Abrahams as Ganja Hightower, following the same basic narrative arc of an anthropologist who becomes afflicted with blood addiction after being stabbed with an ancient dagger. The remake was produced by Chiz Schultz, who had been a producer on the original 1973 film, giving it direct continuity with Gunn's work. Lee funded the project through Kickstarter, making it the platform's first fully crowdfunded feature film. The production was shot guerrilla style over just 3 weeks with a low budget, prioritizing artistic intimacy over commercial horror conventions, much like the original. However, film critics and scholars pointed out significant differences in approach, with film critic and programmer Kelly Weston noting that while Gunn was skilled at subtlety, nuance, complexity, and allowing women the full depth of their own autonomy and independence, these qualities were not among Spike Lee's creative strengths. Most critics agreed that while The Sweet Blood of Jesus was an interesting homage, it wasn't one of the stronger entries in Lee's filmography, lacking the mysterious power that made Gunn's original so compelling. Fact 15. Added to National Film Registry in 2024. After enduring decades of obscurity, brutal re-editing, and critical dismissal, Ganja Hess finally received the recognition it deserved when the Library of Congress selected it for preservation in the United States National Film Registry in 2024. The National Film Registry is a prestigious list of films deemed culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant, and inclusion means the film will be preserved for future generations as part of America's cinematic heritage. This honor came more than 50 years after the film's troubled release, during which time it had gone from box office failure to cult classic to widely acknowledged masterpiece of independent black cinema. The restoration and reappraisal of Ganja Hess began in earnest in the 2000s when organizations like the Museum of Modern Art and the Film Foundation worked to recover Gunn's original cut and make it available to new audiences. By the time of its 50th anniversary in 2023, critics were writing that the film was now widely praised and finally getting the respect it deserved after having been mistreated for decades. The National Film Registry recognition represented the culmination of this journey from misunderstood experiment to recognized classic, vindicating Bill Gunn's artistic vision and the dedication of everyone who worked to preserve and champion his work over the years.